March 17, 1959, dead of night. The streets of Lhasa, the capital of Tibet, were being patrolled by the Armed People's Liberation Army (PLA) of the People's Republic of China. Tension was mounting around the Dalai Lama's summer palace, the Norbulingka, located in the heart of the city. For days, rumors had been swirling through Lhasa that the Chinese were conspiring to kidnap the 14th Dalai Lama, the spiritual and political leader of Tibet. In response to this rumor, thousands of ordinary Tibetans had formed a human wall around the Norbulingka palace to protect their beloved leader. In the midst of that tense situation, under the cover of darkness, the 23-year-old Dalai Lama, disguised as a common soldier, slipped out of the palace with a handful of companions. Thus began an uncertain, perilous journey from Lhasa across the treacherous mountain passes of the Himalayas towards India. This great exodus would change the course of modern Tibetan history. But why did the Dalai Lama have to flee his own homeland? How did Tibet, which had survived for centuries as a mysterious world with its own religion, culture, and system of governance, become a part of China? Was it a peaceful liberation as China claims, or a blatant invasion in the eyes of the Tibetans? What is the historical reality behind the complex relationship between Tibet and China? We will try to find the answers to these questions in this piece. Beijing's current claim of Tibet being a part of China is rooted in a centuries-old relationship. According to China's official narrative, Tibet has been an integral part of China since the 13th century. At the heart of this claim is a special relationship between the Yuan dynasty, founded by the Mongol ruler Kublai Khan, and the Sakya school of Tibetan Buddhism. From the 7th to the 9th centuries, Tibet was a powerful empire that controlled vast parts of Central Asia and competed on equal terms with China's mighty Tang dynasty. The relationship between these two empires was determined by wars and peace treaties. In reality, both were powerful sovereign entities. But the situation changed in the 13th century. When Genghis Khan's grandson, Kublai Khan, conquered China and established the Yuan dynasty, he became drawn to Tibetan Buddhism. He appointed Drogon Chogyal Phadpa, the successor to the influential Tibetan spiritual leader Sakya Pandita, as his spiritual advisor. This forged a new kind of relationship between Tibet and the Mongol Empire, known as the Shoyan, or priest-patron relationship. According to this relationship, the Mongol emperor would be the patron and protector of Tibetan Buddhism, the Yan, and the Tibetan spiritual leader would be the emperor's spiritual guide, the Cho. China claims that it was through this relationship that Tibet first came under China's political structure, as the Mongol rulers were then ruling China. On the other hand, according to Tibetan historians and the government in exile, this relationship was purely spiritual. It was an agreement between two distinct nations, where Tibet did not surrender its political sovereignty. They argue that the Mongols ruled not only China, but also many other regions like Russia and Persia, but Beijing surely cannot claim sovereignty over Moscow on that basis. This complex relationship with Tibet continued during the subsequent Ming and Qing dynasties. Particularly during the Qing dynasty, established by the Manchus from 1644 to 1912, China's influence over Tibet increased. The Qing emperors appointed two high-ranking representatives known as ambans in Lhasa to establish their control over the Dalai Lama and the Tibetan administration. For China, the presence of these ambans is irrefutable proof of their sovereignty over Tibet. But according to the Tibetans, the role of the ambans was primarily like that of an ambassador, and their power was limited. Whenever the central rule in China weakened, Tibet effectively governed itself independently. A new chapter in this debate began at the start of the 20th century. In 1911, the Xinhai Revolution in China led to the fall of the 2,500-year-old monarchy and the collapse of the Qing dynasty. Seizing this opportunity, the then 13th Dalai Lama, Thubten Gyatso, expelled all Chinese representatives and soldiers from Tibet and, in 1913, declared the full independence of Tibet. For the next 4 decades, from 1913 to 1950, Tibet operated as a de facto independent state. During this time, Tibet had its own government, its own army, its own currency, postage stamps, and even passports. They also tried to establish diplomatic relations with several countries, including British India. The most significant event of this period was the 1914 Simla Accord. Representatives from British India, China, and Tibet met in Simla to determine the status of Tibet and the India-Tibet border. This accord proposed dividing Tibet into 2 parts: Outer Tibet, which would be governed by Lhasa and remain effectively autonomous, and Inner Tibet, which would be under Chinese control. The accord also recognized the McMahon Line as the border between India and Tibet. Although the Tibetan and British representatives signed the treaty, the Chinese representatives refused to sign at the last moment. China's objection was mainly about the border between Inner and Outer Tibet. Even though China did not sign, the accord is still considered significant proof of Tibet's ability to negotiate as an independent state. During these 4 decades, while China was ravaged by civil war and foreign invasions, Tibet remained isolated from the rest of the world, maintaining its own way of life and governance. In 1949, the Communist Party, led by Mao Zedong, won the Chinese Civil War and established the People's Republic of China, PRC. From its inception, this new state adopted a policy of reunifying the separated parts of China. Their list included Tibet alongside Taiwan and Hong Kong. Mao Zedong's government announced that it was their sacred duty to liberate Tibet from the clutches of imperialist forces. In October 1950, without any declaration of war, the Chinese People's Liberation Army (PLA) attacked Tibet's eastern province of Shandong. Tibet's small, weak, and poorly equipped army was no match for the Chinese forces. Needless to say, the Tibetan resistance collapsed in the Battle of Shandong. This military invasion forced Tibet to the negotiating table. In 1951, a delegation sent by the young 14th Dalai Lama was taken to Beijing. There, they were pressured into signing an agreement known in history as the 17-Point Agreement for the Peaceful Liberation of Tibet. This agreement is the most controversial document in Tibetan history. According to its terms, Tibet would recognize itself as part of China. The central government of China would control Tibet's defense and foreign relations, and the PLA would enter Tibet. In return, China promised to maintain the existing political system, the status of the Dalai Lama, and religious freedom in Tibet. For China, this agreement is the legal basis for its rule over Tibet. But according to the Tibetan government in exile, this agreement was illegal. They claim that the Tibetan delegates were given no opportunity to negotiate, were prevented from communicating with Lhasa, and were forced to sign the treaty under threats to their lives. It is also alleged that the Tibetan seals used in the agreement were forged in Beijing. The young Dalai Lama and his government only learned of this agreement many months later, and reluctantly accepted it only as a last-ditch effort to prevent Chinese troops from entering Lhasa. An uneasy peace prevailed in Tibet after the 17-Point Agreement. The PLA entered Tibet and gradually began to increase its control. Initially, the Chinese refrained from directly interfering with Tibet's religious and social structures. But at the same time, they began constructing roads, airports, and other infrastructure, which further strengthened their military and administrative control over Tibet. However, the situation began to deteriorate after 1955. The Chinese Communist Party introduced harsh socialist land reforms in the eastern Tibetan provinces of Kham and Amdo, which were culturally part of Tibet but administratively included in China's Sichuan and Qinghai provinces. Monastery lands were confiscated, and nomads were forced to settle down. These reforms were a direct assault on the traditional Tibetan way of life and religious structure. In response, local Tibetans formed armed resistance. From this resistance movement emerged guerrilla forces like the Chushi Gangdruk, 4 Rivers, 6 Ranges, which secretly received training and armed support from the American intelligence agency, the CIA. This resistance movement gradually spread towards central Tibet and Lhasa. In March 1959, tensions in Lhasa reached a boiling point. On March 10th, the Chinese military commander invited the Dalai Lama to a cultural performance, but with the condition that he come alone, without any armed bodyguards. This unusual invitation quickly fueled rumors in Lhasa that the Chinese were planning to abduct the Dalai Lama. As soon as this news spread, thousands of Tibetans spontaneously surrounded the Norbulingka palace. This marked the beginning of the 1959 Tibetan uprising. As the situation spiraled out of control, the Chinese army began a brutal crackdown, even shelling the Norbulingka palace. In the ensuing days of aggression and conflict, thousands of Tibetans were killed. In this bloody scenario, the Dalai Lama realized that his life and the future of Tibet were both in grave danger. Thus, on the night of March 17, he began his historic journey towards India, taking refuge on Indian soil on March 31. Along with him, about 80,000 Tibetans also fled to India. After the Dalai Lama's departure, China established full control over Tibet. Using the 1959 uprising as a pretext, China abrogated the 17-Point Agreement and dissolved the local Tibetan government. In 1965, China formally established Tibet as the Tibet Autonomous Region. In the following decades, especially during Mao Zedong's Cultural Revolution from 1966 to 1976, a dark era descended upon Tibet. Thousands of Buddhist monasteries and cultural artifacts were destroyed. Countless monks, nuns, and ordinary people were killed or tortured. A systematic effort was made to erase Tibet's unique identity. Today, China cites its massive economic development as the justification for its rule over Tibet. They have built vast infrastructure projects like the Qinghai-Tibet Railway, connecting Tibet to mainland China. Beijing claims that they have liberated Tibet from a backward, feudal society and brought it onto the path of modernity, improving people's standard of living. But according to Tibetans and international human rights organizations, a form of cultural genocide is taking place behind the facade of this development. They allege that due to the massive influx of Han Chinese, Tibetans are at risk of becoming a minority in their own land. The Tibetan language and education system are being systematically replaced by the Chinese language. Even possessing a picture of the Dalai Lama or expressing allegiance to him is a punishable crime. Monasteries are under strict surveillance, and the religious freedom of monks is limited. Currently, the 14th Dalai Lama runs the Tibetan government in exile from Dharamshala, India. He has moved away from the demand for independence and adopted the middle way policy, under which he seeks meaningful autonomy for Tibet within the framework of the Chinese constitution. But the Chinese government views him as a separatist and is unwilling to engage in any form of dialogue with him. Therefore, the answer to the question, how did Tibet become a part of China, depends on whom you ask. To China, it is a historical reunification and a mission to liberate a backward region. And to the Tibetans, it is the military occupation of an independent country and an ongoing assault on their rich culture and identity. For this reason, the tragedy of the roof of the world remains an unresolved chapter to this day.